Kathleen is a member of the Cooley Business Department and is special counsel in the firm's healthcare and life sciences regulatory practice. She is a resident in the Washington, D.C. office. Ms. Peterson has provided health regulatory counsel to a range of industry clients, including pharmaceutical and biological manufacturers, distributors, PBMs, managed care organizations, specialty pharmacies, and investment firms. So as you can see, Kathleen really does deal with the entire spectrum in the marketplace, so she really comes from a very well-grounded background here for her next talk. And also, in addition, Kathleen has authored the chapter on the Medicare Part D drug benefit in the American Health Lawyers Association's Medicare Law, 3rd edition, 2012. And also in 2012, Ms. Peterson was selected as a Life Sciences Star by LMG Life Sciences based on peer review, client feedback, and independent research. Please welcome Kathleen Peterson.
Let me just start with, if you'll indulge me for a minute, and we're going to kind of take the time machine back, 10 years or so, and, we don't have a pharma code yet. We don't have, a Bayer or a TAP AWP settlement, in the early 2000s yet. Clinton's still president. The sales forces are running around with cash in their pockets, to use as they feel fit with their physicians. And this concept of average wholesale price, which, most of y'all probably know what we're talking about when we're talking about average wholesale price, but as I was preparing my slides, as we're going to get into some of these newer acronyms, it occurred to me we really do need to just spend a few minutes and really understand what's the deal with average wholesale price, why has it been so controversial, and I think there's some lessons from that we need to think about as we're looking into the future at some of these additional pricing metrics. I think the term average wholesale price has become very vilified, and I think most folks in this room hopefully have had all kinds of compliance training where they've said, you don't market this spread, and you don't set your AWP, and we're going to let the data banks report it. We're not going to decide it on our own. But as we think about what some of the issues have been historically with pricing metrics that are used for pharmacy reimbursement and for a variety of other factors, it's important to understand what the problem was with the AWP. So, just to start, and again, this is a bit of history, so indulge me for a few minutes here. Average wholesale price, as most of y'all probably know, it's not really average, and it's not really wholesale, and it's not really a price. It's frankly, it's one of those terms that I think for many years was used. I don't even want to say intending for it to be a proxy for what the pharmacy's acquisition cost would be, because I think even if you go back into early 2000s, you've got years and years of surveys and studies that say, this really isn't what pharmacies are paying. So I think even if you look back, years and years ago, to argue that, CMS really thought this was a price that pharmacies were paying was probably not the case. I think everyone sort of understood within the industry that this was a bit of a false metric, but it was somewhat of a proxy in terms of coming up with how are we going to pay pharmacies. So with that said, historically, it's been a price, the data banks have reported it at, roughly 20% above WAC. Again, in our time machine, we're back, 10, 12, 13 years or so. You guys all are reporting your own AWPs and saying, oh, we think it's 20% above WAC. And then folks decided, well, maybe it should be more than that. Maybe it should be 25% more than WAC. And, oh, maybe it should be 30 more than WAC. And the pharmacies are thrilled with that because they're making all kinds of money. And, physicians are certainly thrilled with that because they're making all kinds of money. And manufacturers like it because, it's sort of funding, their drug use without actually coming out of their pockets, so they're okay with that. And unfortunately, the government eventually, after many years of kind of getting hit over the head with it, finally said, hey, we're not really okay with that. Because that's our money, and we're using that to pay physicians, and we're using that to pay pharmacies. The Medicaid program is using AWP. The Medicare program is using AWP. Medicare, and many of you are probably aware of this, until really the MMA in the mid-2000s was paying, by and large, 95% of the AWP for reimbursement on outpatient pharmacy. And that's a huge, when you look at the physicians where it was being used to pay in Part B, they were taking home windfalls from this formula. So the reason why I mention this is because one of the problems that manufacturers got themselves into is they saw this and they said, wow, there's this huge ability to really, gain market, particularly in the physician market for our drugs, by basically padding their pockets with government money. So if we report a price, it's not really our price, but it's a little bit higher. And pricing reimbursement metrics are set based on this price. That's going to translate into more money for our customers, which you know, all else equal, you know, if they're going to make money off of our drug and not of our competitor, you know, maybe they'll use our drug. So as we start looking at some of these metrics, and we're going to go through the slides this morning, we really need to be thinking about, you know, one of the things that's fantastic about the pharma industry is the creativity. I have been amazed over the years at watching folks adapt to the changing legal environment, to the changing regulatory environment, to the changing pricing environment with incredibly creative ideas. And so we're going to start talking about actual acquisition cost and, you know, NADAC and some of these new things that are being thrown around to reimburse pharmacy. And I think it would be naive to think that these numbers can't be manipulated. And I'm hopeful that, you know, as we talk about this today, you guys won't be thinking about, wow, she's right, we could totally manipulate those prices. Let's take it back to the business folks. I'm raising this because I think folks need to be very cautious about the potential to manipulate prices, because as we've seen with settlement after settlement after settlement, if something looks too good to be true, it really is. If you're using government money to, you know, pad the pockets of your customers in some form or another, explicitly or implicitly, it's probably going to be a problem. So in any event, one thing you want to be thinking about as we think about these different metrics is what's called the spread. And if you don't know what the spread is, it's the difference between what your customer is paying for your product and what they're getting paid for your product. And obviously the more of that difference, the more money for them. And the more money for them, again, you know, there's potential inducements there that maybe you don't want to be getting into. So in any event, again, AWP, just to harp one more minute on AWP here, it's really still very much in use. I think to say that AWP has been, you know, eradicated and, you know, after the first data bank settlement a few years ago, you know, that we're really not using AWP anymore, that would be naive. And you know, as Ed mentioned, I tend to work with folks on a lot of different parts of the industry, not just the manufacturers, and AWP is still very much in use, but I don't think anyone really likes it. I think people understand AWP isn't where we're going to be forever, and so really everyone's been looking for an alternative. Well, maybe not the pharmacies, but the payers and the manufacturers, I think, have all kind of realized that AWP is going to need to change into something else. But again, we need to recognize this is still very much, I think some 30 states or so are still using AWP as, you know, Medicaid reimbursement in some form or another. The discounts have changed a lot over the years, but, you know, again, it's a very real metric. You know, and as we're going into these other metrics as well, we're going to want to think about not just pharmacy reimbursement, because you're a manufacturer for the most part in this room. I mean, there's some exceptions, but you guys aren't paying the pharmacies. You're not reimbursing the pharmacies. Those are the payers. But you do have the potential to influence how those pharmacies are getting paid, and that's what we'll be talking about. I'm only going to highlight on this slide really the bottom point, which is, so in 2009, as I mentioned before, you know, we had a ton of AWP litigation. There's probably still some ongoing. But one of the cases that was particularly noteworthy for folks was the first databank case, because, and Metaspan, to be fair, where basically it was alleged that these data reporting compendia were intentionally inflating AWPs in order to sort of collude with, you know, the pharmacies and distributors and, you know, get them better payments. And as a result of that settlement, First Databank did stop publishing AWPs. Metaspan initially said they were going to stop, and then they kind of changed their mind, and so it's my understanding they continue to publish AWPs, and nowadays they're probably one of the primary sources for AWP data. But what happened is the industry really evolved very quickly. You know, all these contracts out there that were based off of AWP, you know, when the AWPs were 25, 30% markups off of WAC, very quickly renegotiated contracts to say, well, we're going to kind of have the old AWP and we're going to take 5% or 10% off of it. And there's all these weird like second AWP lists. And to this day, I'm still seeing pharmacy reimbursement with like two numbers, one for sort of the pre-settlement drugs that got adjusted with the AWPs. So as we're thinking through alternatives to AWP and the industry kind of moving away from it, there are very real contract implications for you guys. Because this adjustment didn't always happen automatically. And again, we're going back a few years, but there were a lot of contract provisions that came into play about what if the marketplace changes? What if there's a material change in the reimbursement environment? What's going to happen to our rebate payments, for example, because a lot of rebates used to be paid off of AWP. I mention this because as we think about what if really we see a change in the next several years to this actual acquisition cost-based type reimbursement, are we also going to see similar type changes to your rebate formulas, to your admin fee formulas, to any other formulas that you guys as manufacturers are using that incorporate these types of pricing terms? Will they really still be WAC-based terms, or are you guys going to be trying to align more with what the pharmacy reimbursement looks like? But as you're doing that, you want to be thinking ahead to your contracts. And making sure you're providing for the possibility that the industry is just going to change. So if you're doing like WAC-based contracts right now, it may not be WAC in 5 years. I mean, WAC will still be there in 5 years, I'm pretty sure of that, but you may be looking to other types of reimbursement. The whole industry may be shifting, and you may want to have some of these provisions to deal with what happens if the industry changes. I think just to highlight from a general commercial managed Medicaid perspective, managed Medicare perspective, we are still looking at these AWP-based formulas. We're going to start talking about a lot of these Medicaid changes that have been implemented in the past year or two. Most of those changes, I just want to be very clear, are in the fee-for-service Medicaid arena, which actually is shrinking to some extent. We're seeing a lot of managed Medicaid, for a number of reasons, become more predominant in certain states. And I think as we continue to see the trend towards managed Medicaid, it will be interesting to see if the managed Medicaid and/or managed Medicare plans start looking to actual acquisition cost type reimbursement as well, because we're certainly seeing a trend in fee-for-service Medicaid, which is being driven by a number of factors, to go to paying pharmacies on some metric based on their actual acquisition cost. Currently, under the Medicaid fee-for-service reimbursement regulations that the states, for the most part, have to agree to have some form of this type of reimbursement for their pharmacies. The pharmacies are being reimbursed fee-for-service Medicaid, again, outpatient, most drugs. I'm going to qualify it up to the end because there's all types of exceptions. But for the most part, pharmacies are going to be reimbursed lesser of estimated acquisition cost, which the states have some discretion how they're going to define estimated acquisition cost, plus what's a reasonable dispensing fee, whatever that means, or the pharmacy's usual and customary. Again, it's a term that is somewhat loose and I think has been interpreted differently by different folks over the years, and probably by different states and probably by different pharmacies. So that's kind of where we are now, and frankly that's where we've been for a long time in the fee-for-service Medicaid area as far as the basic regulatory requirement. We'll get into in just a minute, and the proposed rule. I don't want to harp on it too much because, as you all know, it's still a proposed rule. There is a requirement that would change this significantly that CMS has proposed. But currently, we're looking at estimated acquisition cost. Estimated acquisition cost, again, the states have interpreted in a million different ways. You can go to CMS's website. The links will be in the slides you guys can get after. And you've probably all seen the list of 50 states, 50 different methodologies for reimbursement. And it's updated quarterly, and it's fascinating to look at it because it really does change. The states really are evolving their formulas, in pretty quick time. So in any event, the proposed rule would pretty significantly change the requirement on the Medicaid side, fee-for-service. And I don't mean to keep harping on that, but I think it's really important to make the distinction versus managed care on the reimbursement piece. Okay, so the proposed rule, if finalized, instead of EAC plus reasonable dispensing fee, would be an actual acquisition cost plus professional dispensing fee. The professional dispensing fee terminology versus reasonable dispensing fee terminology, I think, is very much intentional. Because as you can imagine, estimated acquisition cost, for the most part, states have interpreted to be some form of AWP or some form of WAC. It's been AWP minus something or WAC plus something. For the most part is how states have defined estimated acquisition cost. We'll get to some exceptions from that in a few minutes. But so with that background, you've got the AWP possibility as a pricing metric. You've got the WAC possibility as a pricing metric. If we move towards an actual acquisition cost, let's assume somewhere in the marketplace there's some discounts that might be trickling down to the pharmacies. If that's the case, WAC, AWP, both of those metrics may actually be higher metrics than actual acquisition cost. So I think there's an understanding, and we've seen this in some of the states that have already moved towards this, that if you reimburse based off of actual acquisition cost, that's going to be a lower starting point than, say, an AWP or a WAC. And so from a practical perspective, the pharmacies are actually performing services. I don't think anybody disputes that, actually dispensing the drugs and, everything that goes into that deserves to be paid for. And historically, the dispense fees under Medicaid fee-for-service have been very, very low. I mean, in a couple dollars range or so. But I think under the new definition that's been proposed for professional dispensing fees, CMS is asking for the states to look at a number of factors, and I think the assumption would be that these dispense fees would go up pretty substantially. We saw, for example, Alabama, and again, I'll get to this slide in a few minutes, but Alabama, which has already moved towards an actual acquisition cost reimbursement, their dispense fees almost doubled after they moved to that, because they also did a survey and said, well, what's the real cost of dispensing for the pharmacies? And let's try to actually pay them, rather than try to proxy and pay them for their services through the spread on, the ingredient cost, let's pay them for their services through an actual dispense fee that's tailored to paying them for their services. And what that means is we're going to see probably a trend towards much higher dispense fees, with possibly, the ingredient cost components going down significantly. But in any event, this is all on the slides you can get after the fact. I don't want to spend too much time training you on the nuances of the proposed rule, because again, it's a proposed rule, and we don't know for certain this is how it will be finalized. So okay, now we're getting to the fun part. So the future of pharmacy reimbursement, and this is where, maybe a few years ago I would have said, we're using a crystal ball. I mean, I think we're seeing the trend is really starting to solidify a little bit more now towards some kind of an actual acquisition cost-based type reimbursement. There's been a number of drivers behind this, not the least of which I think was First Data Bank stopped publishing AWP. I think that kind of scared everyone, and they said, well, AWP, we always kind of knew it wasn't the greatest number. Now one of the biggest publishers has stopped publishing it. We really need to start looking for something else. And we know a number of the state programs went and said we need some kind of a metric. We know that certainly within the industry itself, there's been a push for an additional metric. And then really a pushing off point two is under the Deficit Reduction Act, actually, to go back several more years, this concept of retail survey price started to kind of make its way into the statutes, and we've seen it evolve a little bit over the next couple iterations of the statute. But there's been this statutory push for some kind of an actual acquisition cost type reimbursement as well. So in any event, I think that's where we're probably heading. I think that we probably still have some room for WAC-based reimbursement. Again, WAC I don't think as a metric is going to go away, because you're going to need a list price of some sort always. So it probably makes sense that we'll always see something tied to WAC. Average sales price, again, for Part B type drugs where you report an average sales price, we do see a number of private payers picking up on the average sales prices that have been used for Medicare reimbursement in the past and using it for private pay reimbursement. So average sales price, I think, can continue and probably will continue in some cases to be a reimbursement metric for some products. FULs, I agree with what Alice said before, that I think CMS is particularly interested in FULs. That's one of the real reasons why, one of the many reasons why they've been revising the AMP so substantially, and I think why there's been so much tension between the pharmacies and the manufacturers, because the AMPs mean very different things to you guys. My only reason for not spending too much time emphasizing FULs here is because we've had some analyses, OIG's done some analyses in the past where it looks like as folks move towards this sort of actual acquisition cost, NADAC type reimbursement potentially in the future, that may actually be a more proximate measure of the pharmacy's actual acquisition cost than what they're getting out of the FULs. Now there's a lot of drawbacks to NADAC, which we'll get to in a few minutes, and not the least of which is that it doesn't include discounts. FULs, if calculated using an AMP formula, would account for discounts on some level, although it's going to be a blended, weighted type of a reimbursement. But practically speaking, because of the way that the FUL formula is set up, the states are going to have FULs that are not less than 175% of the weighted AMP. So even if the FULs take into account a number of discounts, they're still finding that these FULs, the draft FULs that CMS has been putting out, tend to be somewhat higher than the actual acquisition costs for the product as they're being figured out without discounts. And so I'm not sure long-term that FULs are really going to be a reimbursement metric. I think they may still be calculated, they may still be reported, but I think the emphasis is really moving towards the NADAC, which we're going to get into. Finally, I also want to mention, I think it's worth mentioning MAC lists, which are maximum acquisition cost lists. You guys, if you don't have a generic product, you may not be aware of what they are, but basically, that's where the state will actually say, we're going to MAC you, is the term, they'll use it as a verb, you know, or a private payer will MAC your drug, where, you know, we're not going to pay more than what your your lowest cost competitor is charging. I mean, there's many ways that MAC can be defined, and there's many ways that MAC is defined. But I'd like to draw the distinction between that and the federal upper limit, because the federal upper limit is basically an aggregate saying, you, state, can't pay more in the aggregate than this relatively high number for these multi-source drugs. Whereas the states can then come back and say, well, yeah, we don't even want to pay that much. We're going to go ahead and put a MAC on the drugs and pay, you know, lowest of the competitors within the, you know, multi-source class, however we're going to do it, and make that part of our state plan, and, you know, that's going to be a lower metric. So anyway, just wanted to kind of get the ground leveled in terms of the acronyms we're going to be going through here. So again, one last point on future pharmacy reimbursement, with the exception of FULs, which I think is worth noting, and it's certainly not a small exception. You know, a few years ago, I would have said, you know, AMP's really poised, you know, to be the next reimbursement metric. You know, we thought after DRA, you know, before the litigation from the pharmacies, that AMP was going to be a public number, and it was going to be on a website, and, you know, it's going to account for all these discounts, and, you know, it sort of seemed like obviously the next step in reimbursement, and the pharmacies were very scared of that, because their concern was, given some of the fluctuations in how AMP is calculated, given the fact that not everybody has access to the same discounts, they were concerned that they would be under-reimbursed for their services under an AMP-based system. And they continue to be concerned with an AMP-based system. As recently as this summer, we saw you know, NACDS and NCPA made some comments to the 3-month rolling average FUL that CMS has been working with, and basically reiterated their concern. You know, we really think AMP-based reimbursement is a bad idea, among other things in their comments. So I think the retail pharmacy industry continues to be concerned with any kind of AMP-based reimbursement metric. So I'm not sure viably that's where the industry is going. So, you know, and moreover, and I've got this at the bottom here, there's a 2011 OIG report where they kind of looked at some of these metrics. They looked at AWP, WAC, and AMP, and they basically said that even though the AMP was based on actual sales transactions, it was the least consistent benchmark of all three of those. And the pharmacies are all about consistency. They don't want to see their reimbursement going like this every week. They want to see something, you know, somewhat smooth so they can do their own financial projections. So again, I think AMP is probably not poised in a really good place as any kind of reimbursement metric, at least not in the near future. So we get back to Medicaid. So, you know, one of the things that Medicaid has historically been is a bit of a testing ground for policies. A lot of what we'll be talking about for the rest of the presentation is Medicaid specific, but I think it's important to understand that what happens in Medicaid very often works its way into the commercial payers as well. Sometimes we'll even see it work its way into other government programs such as Medicare. It tends to be a good testing ground to see, does this type of reimbursement methodology work? You know, let's do it on a small scale in one state and we'll give them a demonstration project, and, you know, maybe it works and it's a great metric, and we'll see broader adoption. So I think a lot of the actual acquisition cost push that we see in Medicaid is indicative of sort of a broader industry push towards that. So one of the things on this slide that I want to point out, though, is the states can't just arbitrarily say we're going to change reimbursement tomorrow. There is a process. If they're going to make any kind of significant changes to how they're paying pharmacies, they're going to have to get what's called a state plan amendment, or a SPA, which will need CMS approval. And so, yeah, again, you want to kind of keep an eye on which states are doing this, who's trying to, you know, mess with their reimbursement formulas, because it could be indicative of trends. On the other hand, it could not. I mean, a state could do something and it could be a flop, and, you know, then we've learned. So in any event, going back to DRA, as amended by ACA, we have the statutory authority for this retail survey price for CMS to do. And for the past few years, CMS has contracted with Myers and Stauffer, a accounting firm that's worked with a number of the states, to do this survey of prices. What they've done, they've contracted for two components of what they perceive to be part of this survey. I'm only pointing out, and again, I think it's interesting, the statutory authority is to do an average of consumer purchase prices. The NADAC, which I keep alluding that we're going to talk about, and I promise we're getting to it, the NADAC is actually not a consumer price survey. It's a pharmacy acquisition cost survey. So I think CMS is kind of working under the authority here for this retail survey price. I know that there's been some question, do they have the authority, don't they have the authority? Frankly, for those of us in the room, I'm not sure it matters if they have the authority because they're doing it. It's something they are doing. They're already currently publishing what they're calling draft NADACs on their website. Until very recently, they were publishing their draft, what they were calling NARPs on their website, which is a little bit more along the lines of a consumer price. But I think that when you think about what CMS is doing, they're making all these numbers public. We also know that in the proposed rule, they want to see the states go towards an actual acquisition cost-based reimbursement. It's very clear the intent is that these types of numbers are going to be used, considered by the states, in thinking about what does their actual acquisition cost look like and what do they need to pay pharmacies. So in any event, CMS does have a report up on the website. I've got some of the links in the slides. They recently announced that they were discontinuing the NARP reporting and that they were discontinuing the new drug reports. There wasn't a ton of detail in the announcement. It was something, funding, pending future funding decisions. One could speculate in connection with, sequestration, or just sort of generally maybe the metric doesn't look as useful as maybe it did at one point. So I'm not sure if there's any intent to actually get the NARP going again, but as it currently stands, CMS has discontinued publishing a NARP and collecting data for a NARP. But so part one was the NARP, which was discontinued. Part two is the National Average Drug Acquisition Cost Survey, which is explicitly intended to be used by Medicaid agencies. The CMS has said we expect states may consider the NADAC as a reference point when they're setting their reimbursement methodology. And the NADAC's kind of interesting because there's a number of things I think that are positive about the NADAC, to be fair. There's also some drawbacks to it. I'm not sure we're ever going to find a perfect metric when we think about pricing, but a few things to point out about the NADAC. One, it's voluntary. Only pharmacies that feel like participating are going to participate, which makes one wonder, could it skew, the pharmacies that are going to participate are potentially the ones that have higher costs because they want to make sure that they're going to get reimbursed adequately. Theoretically, if you're a pharmacy and you've got awesome discounts, maybe you don't want to be the one sending in your pricing because it may skew it down. But that said, discounts is actually a bad term to use in connection with the NADAC because the NADAC is really just invoice price. So unless your discounts are on invoice, like a chargeback type discount, they won't affect your NADAC. The NADAC is being calculated based on this sort of relatively large survey, and the pharmacy industry has been pretty good about saying, yeah, we're going to try to work with this because I think they understand that's probably a better alternative to some kind of AMP reimbursement. But the NADAC survey does not take into account discounts, rebates, off-invoice stuff. So unless the discount actually shows up on the invoice, it's not going to get averaged into the NADAC. The NADAC also excludes specialty pharmacies, and again, because it's a retail price and it's ultimately kind of tied to this retail community pharmacy concept, I don't know if there's any implications for overlap as to whether specialty is a retail, but that's a discussion for another session. But in any event, specialty pharmacies are not included in the NADAC calculation at this time. It kind of leaves the door open for future inclusion. The NADAC would include prescription as well as OTC products, so long as they're covered outpatient drugs. They're measuring your S&I products sort of separately from the end products. The idea is that because this is going to be used for reimbursement, It doesn't need to align completely with your Medicaid drug rebate designations. So CMS has actually allowed a process for states to get an override where the brand generic designation doesn't really work for them. And I think the obvious example of that could be a authorized generic product where a state may treat that as a generic for reimbursement purposes, but a manufacturer for drug rebate purposes would be treating it as an I drug and, you know, paying it the higher rebates. So in the current draft NADACs, you'll see there's a handful of drugs that have been sort of treated as an N drug, even though they're not an N drug, for purposes of the NADAC. And where that comes into play is, I just went back. On the file currently that CMS is putting out, which is a draft file, there's an indicator for the S/I drugs and for some of these other drugs that are being treated differently, for where there's a corresponding generic drug NADAC per unit. You know, the idea being that when states see that, you know, maybe they'll decide to reimburse less for it. So in any event, it's calculated, the numbers are submitted at an NDC 11 level, but it's ultimately calculated at sort of a product group level for purposes of putting the pricing to the NADAC. So you'll still see in the report is like an NDC 11 level report, but within what they're calling a product group, they're calculating one NADAC based on an average of pharmaceutically equivalent products. I point that out because it is not therapeutically equivalent necessarily. So, you know, for those of you who want to get into the weeds on this one, your product grouping could include products theoretically that are pharmaceutically equivalent but not therapeutically equivalent, and whatever pricing implications that may have, you know, could be interesting. The NADAC is a smoothed ratio. I'm sorry, a smoothed metric. But it's not automatically smoothed. Some important numbers to keep in mind are 2%. So if there's a month-to-month change for a branded or SI product or something that's being treated that way, I mean, I have to be, the terminology is a little funky with NADAC, but if you see fluctuations 2% or more month-to-month, then there's going to be a smoothing applied to the branded products, not so much to the generic products. But within that 2% kind of fluctuation threshold, CMS is not going to be, or Myers and Stafford's the case may be, is not going to be recalculating the NADACs because they want to see as much level as they can month to month for purposes of reimbursement. The other number to keep in mind is 5%. Because if there is a price increase, again, with your branded products of 5% or more, like within the month, that's enough to trigger sort of like a weekly review of some of the NADAC prices to allow for sort of a mid-month change in a NADAC if you have a fairly substantial price increase. So these are important percentages to keep in mind as you guys are thinking through just, you know, pricing of the product and how much of a price change are you going to take at any given time. Recognize that, you know, within sort of that 2% range, you may not see the NADACs recalculated. You know, certainly within the 5% range, you're good for the month, but, you know, once you kind of blow the 5% range, you know, you're going to, you know, potentially see a NADAC recalculated pretty quickly. And within the 2% range, you're going to see, you know, kind of more smoothing applied. So in any event, Myers and Stafford is continuing to monitor possible downward skewing. There is a presentation that CMS and Myers and Stafford did back in December where they basically said, listen, we realize this isn't a perfect metric. We realize there's some potential for skewing. We've done some basic analyses, and we don't think things are really that skewed, but on the other hand, we think that, you know, certain things probably could on some level skew it, like, you know, the proportion of chain pharmacies versus independent pharmacies. You know, certain geographies could be skewed. You know, potentially people in rural areas may be negatively affected by, you know, sort of a national acquisition cost because rural acquisition costs might be higher in some cases. So basically CMS said, you know, we're going to keep an eye on it. We understand there's potential issues there, but, you know, at this time, we're going to stick with the methodology that's been proposed. And so I'm going to just for a few minutes go on to FULs, and then I'm going to really spend the rest of the discussion on actual acquisition cost. Because while CMS is sort of, you know, doing these calculations, they're putting out these draft NADACs, you know, theoretically states are going to be thinking about this someday when CMS finalizes it. You know, the actual acquisition costs are metrics that certain states, I think there's 7 states that have actually gone forward and adopted, and as of now are using to reimburse their pharmacies. And so, these are numbers that you can go online and see what they are, so, it may be relevant to be aware of. But in any event, the federal upper limits, we could probably spend all day on that, but we won't. Federal upper limits, as we talked about before, are basically, an aggregate, I use the word cap loosely on how much the states can reimburse for certain multi-source drugs. I don't want to say cap because, again, as the way that the ACA wrote the federal upper limit provisions, it was that the federal upper limits can't be less than 175% of the weighted amps. So, it leaves open sort of what will they actually look like. CMS for a couple years now has been posting what they're calling draft FULs based on the ACA FUL calculation. These FULs are not implemented yet by the states because they are still in draft. The current FULs that are still being used by the states are actually not going back to the DRA, but going back to before the DRA. The pre-DRA FUL calculation, just throwing a whole bunch of acronyms in one sentence, is 150% of basically the lowest published price of a drug. So it's either usually an AWP or a WAC-based price. The studies that OIG has done in the past have basically said that the current FULs are something like 60% more, 61% more than acquisition cost. Like they're really not proportionate to acquisition costs. So if you're a pharmacy and you're looking at the current FULs, it really doesn't matter. I mean, you're probably getting reimbursed less than the FUL anyway. But the idea would be that moving towards these new draft FULs under the ACA, if they become final, we'd see a lower FUL. But as I kind of start out with, even with the new ACA FULs, they're still probably going to be somewhat higher in the aggregate than the pharmacy acquisition costs. So we may still see folks looking more towards an NADAC for reimbursement in the long run. But in any event, the draft FULs are up. They have been for some time, but they are not final. One thing that's been a recent change is CMS has started publishing, in addition to the regular draft FULs, they're now doing a 3-month rolling average FUL because there was some concern expressed by the pharmacy industry that the FULs as published in the draft were fluctuating more. So the 3-month rolling average is intended to smooth that and see less fluctuation. Pharmacy industry isn't really thrilled about it. There were some comments put in by, again, NACDS and NCPA along the lines of, CMS, based on the guidance you have out there, you're kind of letting people choose which number to use. Again, the quote up there, the first paragraph is from the CMS presentation. States can use the draft monthly AMP-based FUL or the 3-month rolling average once they're finalized, depending on their state plan. So, could it allow the states to flip-flop depending on what works for them? It's a little bit open. So in any event, neither the NADACs nor the FULs that are currently being published are final. If I was a betting person, and there's probably someone around here from CMS who could, call me on it if I'm wrong, I would say we probably won't see them final until we see a final rule. The statute actually currently says that the FULs should become implemented even if we don't have a final rule, but I think it's such a controversial issue that, they just haven't been yet, despite, some significant pressure from OIG and, their auditing capacity. But basically, CMS currently says, we're still looking at comments on FULs. I mean, not in a regulatory rulemaking capacity, but on their website, they'll still accept comments on the FULs and the methodology. So, again, if you feel like it's something, you feel strongly about how they're calculating it, you still have an opportunity to actually be continuing to submit your thoughts. And then at some point, after CMS has considered all these comments on the draft FULs, the draft NARPs, which aren't being published anymore, the draft NADACs, the draft monthly new drug report, which isn't being published anymore, once all that's been kind of synthesized, then they're looking to finalize. So I don't know what that means in terms of timing, but again, if I was a betting person, I'd say maybe sometime when the new final rule comes out. Who knows at this point, maybe it's January. We don't know for sure. We guess we'll be surprised. So in any event, and can I just get a quick time check? I don't want to. Okay. So the last couple slides, and a lot of this is just detail I put in for you guys for your reference. So I'm really not going to be reading the slides verbatim. And when you guys have the hard copies in your leisure, you can look and see what the different states are doing with AAC. But the basic point here is we do have a number of states that really took the reins and said, you know what? we're done with AWP, we're done with WAC, we're going to AAC, we don't care if there's no final NADACs yet. Some of them even came out before the NADACs. So Alabama, Colorado, Idaho, Iowa, Louisiana, and Oregon have already implemented AAC-type reimbursement. We know there's some other states that plan to follow. I highlight New York here for 2 reasons. One, because they're big and a lot of people care about what New York's doing. 2, because New York's proposed definition would be inclusive of discounts, which would be, a bit of a deviation from some of what we've seen in the past. So they're still trying to, from what I gather, figure out how they're going to account for discounts. I know aspirationally New York had posted on their website they were hoping to get this up and running by May of 2013. As of the 2Q CMS reports, New York was still using I believe a WAC-based formula, so I don't believe it's been finalized. If I'm wrong on that, let me know. But again, as of the 2Q reports, they were still not moved over to the WAC-based, the AAC-based reimbursement. So that's New York. But interestingly, other states like California have pulled back. California initially was probably one of the front runners that said, we're going to do our own thing, we're going to do actual acquisition costs. And, years ago, they were going to do like ASP and all kinds of crazy things. They actually have put it on hold. They said, you know what? Let's see what CMS does with the NADACs. You can certainly appreciate from a state budget perspective that makes sense. It's not cheap to get an actual acquisition cost. You've got to get someone to do the survey and someone to pull it all together and on a monthly basis put it up there. Myers and Stauffer, to their credit, has really taken, this market, and, most of the states, not all of them, are currently using them to perform this service. So California actually recently just said, you know what, we're going to hold off, even though we've kind of got the authority, we were going to do it, we put out a bid for it, we're going to wait and see what happens with NADAC. So I mentioned dispense fees. Again, you can look at the CMS chart of all the different states and dispense fees, but you will see that, with certain exceptions, the states that have moved towards AAC have really dramatically increased their dispense fees for the reasons we talked about already. Interestingly, there's a few other states that have kind of done a smaller scale type acquisition cost, mostly in the 340B context. Arizona, like if you're a federally qualified health center or a lookalike, then you have, and it's 340B drug, you're going to be basically capped at 340B acquisition cost. I believe there's a relatively higher dispense fee there, but that's the gist of it. Massachusetts, Colorado, Illinois, but just for implantable contraceptive devices. So again, sort of on a smaller scale, but we do see other states moving towards this as well, and I think there's some other states that have longer term plans to go to AAC on a broader scale. I'm not going to read the next couple of slides. It's just kind of highlighting what the different states are doing. I guess what I would point out is what's interesting in the state AAC initiatives is they are all kind of doing it their own ways. A lot of it's very similar to what CMS is doing at the NADAC level, but they also have different guns to pull. So while the CMS survey is a voluntary survey, most of the state surveys are mandatory. If you want to participate as a pharmacy provider in the program, a number of the states will require you to submit your pricing information. Colorado, who I think I just skipped over, it's interesting. They have a, wait, no, it's not Colorado. Who is it? Here we go. Idaho, you don't have to respond to the survey, but if you don't respond to the survey, you get reimbursed at the lower of the dispense fees. They have a tiered dispense fee set for their pharmacy program. So if you want the higher dispense fee, you'd better be responding to the survey. And then I guess just a few other points. I think some of the states are only doing it, semi-annually. You've got, twice a year, so that has implications for what your actual, relative relation of your actual acquisition cost price is to what the pharmacy's actual acquisition cost is at a given time. Obviously, the more frequently the surveys are done, the more likely those costs will actually look like what the pharmacies are getting paid. Is oftentimes the discussion on rebates, on discounts, on value for a pharmaceutical manufactured product comes down to what's this going to mean to a payer in terms of sort of the net cost to the payer for the product. When the payer is looking at what they're paying for the product versus how much they are getting for the product, they oftentimes want to see apples to apples comparisons. That's why for a long time, I think we were still seeing folks look for AWP-based discounts even when AWP was sort of out of fashion. So I think as we start to see these move towards actual acquisition cost type reimbursement, I don't think it's completely illogical to think we're going to see payers that are going to want to start seeing rebates, discounts, other things perhaps tied to these types of metrics. So it is really important to understand what the metrics are. I also think it's important to not screw around with the metrics. I mean, we talk about discounts, off-invoice stuff. I think if you start thinking about too creatively, what you could be doing with these metrics and giving like off-invoice discounts to pharmacies and potentially giving them better reimbursement because of that's probably not a road you want to be going down for that reason. And again, there's always a number of other legal issues kicked in from these types of things. And I guess my very last point is, this is all kind of mid-term to slightly longer term in terms of where I think pharmacy reimbursement's going. But as I'm sure you all in this room have heard, there's this general buzz about going more towards some kind of an outcomes-based, cost-effectiveness-based type reimbursement, which may have nothing to do with actual acquisition cost. It may have nothing to do with AMP. And it's just something, as we're thinking through pharmacy reimbursement and where it's going, I think you always have to keep in mind that there's definitely a push towards sort of a value-based reimbursement as well. And it's going to be interesting, I think, over the next 5 to 10 years to see where that takes us. And so that's all I've got. I know I talk fast. I know I had a lot of acronyms, and I'm happy in the break to take any questions. Thanks.